No one could explain it. Not the veterinarians, not the professional trainers, not even the Mafia boss himself. For nearly 5 years, Titan and Nero, two of the most feared pit bulls in Boston, had attacked every woman who came near their master. Socialites, housekeepers, lawyers, even the beautiful fiancée the Mafia boss planned to marry. The scars they left behind became mansion legend. Then one rainy Monday morning, a plus-sized maid, earning barely enough to pay her rent, walked through the front gates carrying nothing but a mop and a lunch bag. The dogs saw her. The guards screamed. Someone yelled, "Get her out of there!" The two pit bulls charged. Everyone braced for blood. Instead, the giant dogs threw themselves at her feet, rolled onto their backs, and whimpered for belly rubs. The entire courtyard fell silent. The Mafia boss didn't understand. His dogs had never trusted anyone that quickly. Then something even stranger happened. Every single time his fiancée entered the room, the dogs stood between her and the maid, growling, watching, refusing to move. Everyone believed the pit bulls had finally gone mad. Only the maid whispered 6 words that changed everything. Dogs don't hate without a reason. She had no idea. Those 6 words were about to uncover a betrayal so devastating it would bring one of the most powerful mafia empires in the country to its knees. Before we rewind to that rainy Monday morning and find out exactly why those dogs chose her, if you believe animals can see the truth about people long before we're willing to admit it, hit subscribe, because Titan and Nero are about to prove that in a way you won't forget. And tell me in the comments, have you ever had a pet who instantly loved or instantly distrusted someone and turned out to be completely right about them? Type "dogs don't lie" below if you already trust an animal's instincts more than most people's first impressions. Now, let's go back to the gates of the Moretti estate before anyone understood what those two pit bulls already knew. The Moretti estate had a rule that everyone learned within their first hour of employment, whether anyone bothered to say it aloud or not. Stay clear of the courtyard after sundown, and never, under any circumstances, approach Titan and Nero without an escort. Grace Donovan didn't know the rule yet. She'd been on the property for exactly 11 minutes. "You're the temporary?" The head housekeeper, a sharp-eyed woman named Dolores, looked Grace over with the particular skepticism reserved for anyone hired on short notice. "Agency said you'd worked estates before. Smaller ones, nothing this size." Grace shifted her bag on her shoulder, taking in the sprawling stone facade, the manicured hedges, the sheer scale of a house that could have swallowed her entire childhood neighborhood twice over. "But floors are floors, ma'am. I imagine yours just take longer." Dolores's mouth twitched, something almost like approval. Last girl lasted 4 days. Chef before her lasted 2. She said it like a warning, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely certain why. "This way. Mr. Moretti likes new staff introduced to the—" A commotion erupted somewhere behind them, sudden and sharp, boots pounding stone, a man's voice shouting something Grace couldn't quite make out over the sudden chaos of barking. "Oh God!" Dolores went pale. "The gate!" Someone left the gate open. Grace turned in time to see 2 enormous shapes tearing across the courtyard at a dead sprint. Gray-brindled, muscled, easily 80 pounds each, moving with a speed and purpose that sent 3 groundskeepers scattering for cover and 1 security guard fumbling for a weapon he clearly hadn't expected to need on a Monday morning. "Get her out of there!" someone screamed. Grace had approximately 2 seconds to process the fact that her almost certainly meant herself, standing directly in the animal's path with nowhere useful to run and no time left to try. She didn't run. Old instinct, the kind her grandfather had drilled into her over a decade of fostering rescue dogs nobody else wanted. Dogs written off as dangerous by shelters that had never once bothered learning their names, took over before her fear could. She dropped her bag, planted her feet, lowered her eyes just slightly, and let her whole body go loose and unthreatening, exactly the way he'd taught her. Don't challenge them. Don't run. Let them decide. The two Pitbulls closed the final distance at full speed, and for one suspended, terrifying heartbeat, Grace genuinely believed she'd misjudged everything. Then they hit her, not with teeth, but with the full, joyful weight of 80 pounds each, throwing themselves against her legs, knocking her clean off her feet and down into the grass, where they proceeded to roll onto their backs, tails thumping wildly, tongues lolling in an expression so purely delighted it bordered on comedic. The courtyard went absolutely silent. Grace laughed before she could stop herself, scratching one dog's exposed belly while the other shoved his enormous head under her arm, demanding equal attention with a low, happy whine. "Well, hello to you too," she murmured, entirely unbothered by the chaos she was apparently causing around her. "Don't move." A man's voice cut sharp across the courtyard, low and controlled in a way that suggested he rarely needed to raise it to be obeyed. "Titan. Nero. Down." Both dogs' ears flicked toward the voice, tails still wagging, though they didn't fully obey. One of them, the slightly larger of the two, simply flopped his head into Grace's lap and sighed contentedly, as though the command had been optional advice rather than an order. Grace looked up to find the source of the voice crossing the courtyard toward her, and understood immediately why the entire estate seemed to move around him like water around a stone. He was tall, dark-suited despite the early hour, moving with the same coiled economy she recognized in dogs that had learned, somewhere along the way, that stillness was its own kind of power. His face held no visible alarm, only a sharp, assessing focus that made her suddenly, acutely aware of the grass stains now covering her uniform. "They've never done that," he said, stopping several feet away, dark eyes moving between her and the two dogs still sprawled contentedly across her lap. "Not once. Not with anyone. They seem friendly enough to me. They're not friendly." His jaw tightened slightly. "They've bitten 4 people in the last 2 years alone. One of them required stitches." Grace glanced down at Titan, who chose that exact moment to roll further onto his back, exposing his belly with the shameless trust of an animal who'd apparently decided, within 30 seconds of meeting her, that she posed absolutely no threat whatsoever. "Maybe they just don't like the people you've been introducing them to," she said, and immediately wondered if she'd just talked herself out of a job on her very first morning. Something flickered across his expression, not quite amusement, but close, gone before it fully arrived. "Get up," slowly. "I'd rather not test how long their good mood lasts." Grace obeyed, easing carefully out from beneath both dogs, who whined in protest but allowed it, immediately pressing against her legs the moment she stood, refusing to put more than a few inches of distance between themselves and her. "Matteo Moretti," the man said. Extending a hand, she noticed the security detail watching with unusual tension. "This is my home, and apparently, my dogs have opinions I wasn't informed of." "Grace Donovan." She shook his hand, aware of Titan pressing his considerable weight against her leg the entire time, as though guarding her from something. "I'm the temporary maid. Dolores was just showing me around when your dogs decided to make an entrance. They don't usually run loose during the day." Matteo's gaze flicked toward one of the security guards, sharp and questioning, and the man paled visibly, already stammering an explanation about a faulty gate latch. "Someone will answer for that oversight. I don't mind, for what it's worth." Grace scratched Nero's ear, earning a contented groan. "I grew up around dogs like this. Bully breeds get a bad reputation they usually didn't earn." Matteo studied her for a long moment, something calculating behind his composed expression, the kind of assessment she imagined he brought to every new variable that entered his carefully controlled world. "You're not afraid of them. Should I be? Everyone else is. Everyone else probably walked in here already believing they were monsters." Grace shrugged, entirely unbothered by his scrutiny. "Dogs know the difference. They always do." Dolores cleared her throat pointedly from several feet away, apparently having decided it was finally safe to approach, and Mateo's attention shifted, though Grace noticed his eyes lingered a moment longer than strictly necessary before he turned fully away. "Get settled," he said. "Dolores will show you your duties." He walked back toward the house without another glance, though both dogs remained rooted firmly at Grace's side, refusing every command to follow him, until finally, with visible reluctance, they abandoned their new favorite person and trotted after their owner across the courtyard. Grace watched them go, brushing grass from her uniform, aware of Dolores staring at her with an expression somewhere between shock and open curiosity. "In 5 years," Dolores said slowly, "I have never once seen those dogs do that." "Do what? Say hello? Trust anyone?" Dolores shook her head, already turning back toward the house. "You'd best come inside before Mr. Moretti decides to ask you more questions. He doesn't usually take this much interest in new staff." Grace glanced once more toward the mansion's grand entrance, where Matteo Moretti had already disappeared, and felt an odd, unplaceable flicker of unease settle beneath her curiosity. She had no way of knowing yet that she'd just become the single most interesting variable to enter Matteo Moretti's carefully guarded world in over a decade, or that 2 loyal, instinctive dogs had just set into motion a chain of events that would nearly bring his entire empire crashing down around them both. Grace's first day settled into a rhythm by mid-afternoon, polishing silver in the East Wing, learning the particular superstitions of a kitchen staff who refused to discuss anything sensitive within earshot of the security cameras, memorizing which hallways required a keycard and which merely required good posture and the confidence to look like she belonged. Titan and Nero found her twice more before dinner, trotting up from wherever they'd been napping to press against her legs for exactly as long as she'd allow, then wandering off again, apparently satisfied. "They like you," said one of the younger maids, a girl named Priya, watching with open fascination as Nero rested his enormous head briefly against Grace's hip before continuing his patrol of the hallway. "That's genuinely never happened before. Not even with Mr. Moretti's own family, when they visit. Dogs are simple creatures. I probably just smell like bacon. You didn't cook any bacon. Then it's a mystery for the ages." Grace smiled, though privately she suspected it was something else entirely. The particular calm she'd learned to carry around animals who'd been taught, by whatever hands had shaped them, that most humans meant danger. She hadn't done anything special. She'd simply waited and let them decide, and that alone seemed to have been enough. She was still turning the thought over when the front doors opened, and the temperature of the entire hallway seemed to shift. A woman swept in, wrapped in pale silk, dark hair pinned with the kind of effortless precision that suggested a stylist rather than a mirror. Every movement calibrated for an audience, even in an empty foyer. Grace didn't need an introduction to understand who she was looking at. The way the staff around her straightened, the way conversations dropped to careful murmurs, told her plainly enough. Titan noticed before Grace did. The dog, who moments earlier had been contentedly sprawled across the hallway rug, rose in one fluid motion, ears flattening, a low growl building in his chest that hadn't been present a second earlier. "Titan," Matteo's voice, from the top of the staircase, sharp with warning. "Enough." The growl didn't stop. If anything, it deepened, Titan's entire body angling itself between the approaching woman and the hallway beyond, every line of him rigid, with something that looked far more deliberate than simple bad temper. "Isabella." Matteo descended the stairs quickly, positioning himself between the dog and his fiancée with the ease of long practice. "I apologize. He's been unsettled all day." "He's always unsettled around me, darling." Isabella's voice carried a practiced lightness, though Grace noticed her eyes tracking the dog with something considerably colder than amusement. "I've stopped taking it personally. I'll have him removed. Please do." Matteo snapped his fingers once, sharp, and one of the security staff moved quickly to lead Titan away, the dog resisting every step, twisting his head back toward Isabella with a low, continuous growl that didn't fade until he'd been pulled entirely out of sight. Grace, forgotten in the corner with her polishing cloth, watched the entire exchange with quiet, careful attention. She'd worked with enough difficult dogs to recognize the difference between simple jealousy and genuine alarm. And what she'd just witnessed hadn't looked like jealousy at all. Titan hadn't been competing for attention. He'd been trying to create distance, the particular, deliberate positioning of an animal attempting to protect something or someone from a threat only he could perceive. She didn't say anything. It wasn't her place, and she'd known this family for exactly one day. But she filed the observation away anyway, the way she filed away everything, and returned to her polishing with considerably more attention than the silver strictly required. She found Matteo alone in the small library off the east hallway later that evening, staring at a tumbler of scotch he hadn't touched, Titan lying pointedly on the far side of the room, still refusing to fully relax. "You're not supposed to be in here," Matteo said without looking up. "I was collecting glasses. I can leave. You can stay." He glanced toward her, something tired behind his usual composure. "You've been here one day, and my dogs have already caused 2 scenes. I imagine you're regretting the agency's referral." "I've seen worse first days." Grace set down her tray, studying him for a moment, before deciding, against every instinct of professional caution, to say what she'd been holding back all evening. "Can I ask you something? About Titan? You're going to anyway. Fair." She almost smiled. He wasn't jealous of Isabella. Not the way you'd expect a possessive dog to act, at least. He was trying to get between her and something, positioning himself, not just reacting. Matteo's expression shifted, something sharper cutting through the exhaustion. "You've known him one day." "I've known dogs like him my whole life." Grace crossed her arms. "My grandfather trained rescues nobody else wanted. Dogs everyone else had already written off as dangerous, unpredictable, unsalvageable. I learned pretty quickly that dogs don't growl without a reason. People love to say animals are simple. They're not. They're just honest, which is considerably rarer. Isabella has done nothing to provoke that kind of reaction. Maybe not that you've seen." Something flickered across Matteo's face. Not quite anger, but close. The particular defensiveness of a man being asked to question something he'd already decided was settled. "She's going to be my wife," he said, quieter now. "I've known her 2 years. My dog's disliking her doesn't change that." "I'm not saying it does." Grace held up both hands, careful now, aware she'd pushed further than a temporary maid on her first day had any business pushing. "I'm just telling you what I saw. What you do with it is entirely your business." He studied her for a long moment, something unreadable behind his dark eyes, and Grace found herself unexpectedly unwilling to look away first. "You're very direct," he said finally, "for someone in your position. I've found honesty gets people fired considerably less often than people assume. It's the lying that usually does you in eventually." She picked her tray back up, aware she'd probably said more than enough for one evening. "Good night, Mr. Moretti." She was nearly to the door when his voice stopped her. "Grace." She turned. "Titan's never wrong," he said quietly, almost to himself, staring at the untouched scotch in his hand. "In 5 years, he's never once been wrong about anyone who's walked through that door. Then maybe it's worth finding out why he's growling now." She left him sitting with that thought, Titan's watchful eyes tracking her all the way out of the room, and made her way toward the servants' quarters with the distinct, uneasy feeling that she'd just stepped into something considerably larger than silver polishing and grass stains. She wasn't wrong. 3 nights later, unable to sleep, she wandered down toward the kitchen for water and passed Matteo's private study just as the door stood slightly ajar, and found Isabella inside, alone, phone held close to a stack of confidential documents spread across the desk, photographing page after page with the quiet, practiced efficiency of someone who had clearly done this many times before. Grace didn't move. For one long frozen second, She stood in the darkened hallway watching Isabella's phone flash silently, page after page of dense financial text captured in careful, methodical succession, and felt her pulse climb into her throat. Isabella looked up. Grace stepped back instinctively, but not quickly enough. Their eyes met through the narrow gap in the doorway, and for a moment neither woman moved, the silence stretching taut between them. Then Isabella smiled, easy and warm, tucking the phone smoothly into her clutch, as though she'd been doing nothing more suspicious than checking a text message. Grace, was it? Her voice carried the same practiced lightness Grace had heard in the foyer. Couldn't sleep either? Water, Grace managed, gesturing vaguely toward the kitchen. Sorry to interrupt. You're not interrupting anything. Isabella crossed to the door, closing the gap between them with unhurried steps. Matteo left some paperwork out. I was simply organizing it for him. He's terribly disorganized, bless him. Of course. Grace kept her expression carefully neutral, the way she'd learned to keep her body language neutral around dogs who might read tension as threat. Good night. She walked away without waiting for a response, her heart hammering, forcing herself not to hurry, despite every instinct screaming at her to put distance between herself and that study as quickly as possible. She didn't sleep that night. She debated telling Matteo for 2 full days. It wasn't her place. She was a temporary maid, 2 weeks into an assignment that would end the moment the agency found a permanent replacement, and accusing a man's fiancée of photographing confidential documents felt like precisely the kind of overstep that ended careers rather than launched them. But she thought of Titan's low, deliberate growl. She thought of the particular, careful efficiency in Isabella's hands, the speed of someone well-practiced at exactly this kind of task. She found Matteo alone in his study on the 3rd evening and told him everything. He didn't interrupt. He listened with the same still, coiled focus she'd noticed that first morning in the courtyard, his jaw tightening incrementally with every detail she offered. You're certain, he said once she'd finished. Certain it was my financial documents. I saw the letterhead. Moretti Holdings, at the top of at least 2 pages. Grace kept her voice steady. I don't know what was in them beyond that. I didn't get close enough to read details. Matteo was quiet for a long moment, staring at the desk where, 3 nights earlier, Isabella had apparently sat photographing his private business. I'll look into it, he said finally. He did. Quietly, thoroughly, over the following 2 days, though when he found Grace again, his expression carried the particular frustration of a man who'd hit a wall he hadn't expected. Nothing, he said, closing the study door behind him. No documents missing. No files disturbed. If she photographed anything, she's already covered every trace of it. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. No. His eyes met hers, something grim settling behind them. It means whoever she's working with is considerably more careful than I initially assumed. The admission hung between them. The first time Matteo had said, whoever she's working with. Aloud, the first crack in whatever careful denial he'd been maintaining about the woman he'd planned to marry. You believe me, Grace said quietly. I believe my dogs, he said. You simply gave me a reason to finally listen to them. From that evening forward, Grace found herself paying attention in ways she hadn't consciously decided to adopt, noticing which staff members Isabella spoke to privately, which phone calls she took outside on the terrace where no one could overhear, the particular tension that entered her shoulders whenever Matteo mentioned the wedding timeline moving up. Titan and Nero noticed too. They shadowed Grace constantly now, trailing her through hallways and kitchens with a loyalty that had become, in the space of barely a week, entirely unshakable. Dolores had stopped commenting on it. The other staff had simply accepted it as one more strange feature of an already strange household. They trust you more than they trust me, Matteo observed one evening, watching Nero rest his head against Grace's knee while she sat polishing silver in the small parlor off the kitchen. And I've fed them every day for 5 years. Maybe you've been too busy running an empire to properly say thank you. I say thank you. To your dogs? I pet them occasionally. Grace laughed, the sound surprising them both. That's not quite the same, but I suppose it's a start. Something shifted in Matteo's expression, warm and unguarded in a way she hadn't seen from him before, gone again almost as quickly as it arrived. He sat across from her, uninvited, watching her work with an attention that made her acutely aware of her own hands. "You've made this house considerably more bearable in 2 weeks," he said finally. "I don't entirely know what to do with that." "You could start by not looking so alarmed about it." "I'm not alarmed. You look like a man being informed his empire has a structural flaw he hadn't accounted for." Matteo's mouth twitched, close to a genuine smile. "That may be an accurate description." Before either of them could examine that further, Daniel, Matteo's head of security, a broad-shouldered man Grace had exchanged perhaps 10 words with since her arrival, appeared in the doorway, his expression grim enough that both Titan and Nero rose instantly, sensing the shift in the room before a single word had been spoken. "Boss." Daniel's voice was tight. "It's Salvatore." Matteo's entire posture changed, the warmth of a moment earlier vanishing entirely. "What about him?" "He asked to meet you tonight. Said he'd found something about the leak. Something he wanted to tell you in person, away from the house." Daniel's jaw worked. "He never made it to the meeting point. Patrol found him 20 minutes ago, behind the old boathouse." "Is he alive?" Daniel's silence answered before his words did. "He's gone, boss. Single shot, close range. Whoever did this knew exactly where he'd be, and exactly when." Daniel's eyes flicked briefly toward Grace, wary, before returning to Matteo. "Whatever Salvatore found, he never got the chance to tell us." The parlor went completely silent, save for Nero's low, uneasy whine, his head pressed hard against Grace's leg as though sensing, better than any of them, exactly how much danger had just settled over the entire estate. Pugs. Matteo spent the following 2 days in near constant motion. Meetings behind closed doors, security patrols doubled around the estate's perimeter, a grim, controlled fury, replacing the brief warmth Grace had glimpsed in the parlor before Daniel's news arrived. He found her on the 3rd morning, alone in the linen room, and closed the door behind him with a quiet click that made her set down the folded sheets in her hands. "I need to ask something of you," he said. "Something outside your usual duties." "I'm listening." "Isabella trusts you, more than she trusts most of the staff, for reasons I don't entirely understand." He crossed his arms, something reluctant in his expression, as though the request cost him more than he wanted to admit. "I need eyes on her, someone who can move through this house without drawing suspicion, who can notice the small things a security detail would miss. You want me to spy on your fiancé? I want the truth." His jaw tightened. "One of my most loyal men is dead because he found something worth killing over. I can't afford to keep pretending Titan's instincts are simply bad temper." Grace studied him for a long moment, the weight of what he was asking settling heavily between them. She thought of Salvatore, a man she'd exchanged perhaps 3 sentences with in 2 weeks, now gone because he'd gotten too close to something dangerous. "All right," she said finally. "But if I find nothing, you accept that too. I won't manufacture suspicion just to give you an answer you're braced for." Agreed. It took 4 days of careful, unremarkable attention before Grace noticed the pattern. Isabella left the estate every afternoon at exactly 2 o'clock, claiming errands, appointments, wedding preparations that required her personal attention. It ordinary enough, except Grace had begun noticing the particular route she took through the gardens each time. Not toward the main gate, where the estate's cars waited, but toward the old service entrance near the eastern wall, half hidden behind an overgrown hedge that hadn't been trimmed in years. On the 5th day, Grace followed. She kept her distance, moving with the same unhurried patience she'd learned watching skittish rescue dogs, until she reached a gap in the hedge that offered a clear view of the service gate beyond. Isabella stood there, phone pressed to her ear, speaking in low, urgent tones Grace couldn't quite make out. A man waited beside a dark sedan parked just outside the estate's boundary. Tall, heavily built, his face turned mostly away, though something about his posture, the careful, professional stillness of him, made Grace's stomach tighten with instinctive alarm. She edged closer, trying to catch a clearer look at his face. A twig snapped beneath her foot. Isabella's head turned sharply toward the hedge. Before Grace could decide whether to freeze or retreat, the world exploded into chaos. The first gunshot cracked from somewhere near the eastern wall, sharp and deafening, followed immediately by a second and third shouts, erupting across the garden as Matteo's security detail scrambled into motion. Grace dropped instinctively, heart hammering, as more shots tore through the hedge above her head, shredding leaves and branches in a violent spray. "Grace!" Matteo's voice, distant but sharp with panic, cutting through the chaos. "Grace!" She tried to answer, tried to move, but a heavy weight slammed into her from the side, knocking her flat against the garden path. Not an attacker, she realized in the same instant, but Titan, his body covering hers entirely, absorbing the impact of a bullet that would otherwise have found her exposed back. The dog yelped, sharp and pained, but didn't move, didn't retreat, holding his position over her with fierce, trembling determination even as Nero arrived seconds later, snarling toward the direction of the gunfire, with a ferocity Grace had never witnessed from either animal. "Down, stay down." Matteo reached her moments later, dragging her upright and immediately shielding her body with his own, pulling her behind the thick stone base of a garden statue, while Daniel and two more guards returned fire toward the eastern wall. The exchange lasted less than a minute, though it felt considerably longer. Gunfire cracking and echoing across the garden until finally, abruptly, silence fell. "Clear!" Daniel shouted. "They're retreating!" Matteo didn't loosen his grip on Grace, his whole body still curled protectively around hers, his breathing ragged against her hair. "Are you hurt?" His voice came out rough, stripped of its usual composure entirely. "Grace, look at me. Are you hurt?" "I'm fine." Her own voice shook badly, adrenaline still flooding through her. "Titan. He took a hit, I think. I need to check." "Titan can wait one more second." Matteo's hands found her face, checking for injury with a desperation that surprised them both, before he seemed to catch himself, pulling back slightly, though his eyes remained locked on hers with an intensity that had nothing to do with security protocol. "You could have died. So could you." Something passed between them, raw and unguarded, before Titan's pained whimper broke the moment entirely, and Grace scrambled toward the dog, running careful hands along his side until she found the wound, a graze along his shoulder, bloody but shallow, considerably less severe than she'd feared. "He's going to be fine," she said, relief flooding through her voice. "It's not deep. He needs a vet, but he's going to be fine." Matteo knelt beside her, resting a hand briefly against Titan's head, something raw and grateful in his expression that Grace suspected he rarely allowed anyone to witness. "He saved you," Matteo said quietly, without hesitation. "He's a good dog. He's the best judge of character I've ever known." Matteo's eyes lifted to hers. "Apparently he decided you were worth protecting the moment he met you." Daniel approached before Grace could respond, his expression grim, something small and dark clutched in one gloved hand. "Boss, found this near the service gate." He held it out. A phone. Its screen cracked but still functioning, clearly dropped in the chaos of the attack. "It's not one of ours." Matteo took it carefully, and Grace watched his expression shift from confusion to something far colder as he swiped the screen and found it, miraculously, still unlocked. Row after row of encrypted messages filled the display, timestamps stretching back months, the sender's name displayed simply as a series of numbers. He turned the phone toward Grace, his jaw tight with barely contained fury. This was Isabella's. They gathered in Matteo's study an hour later, the garden still crawling with security sweeping for evidence. Titan bandaged and resting near Grace's feet, despite the veterinarian's insistence that he stay confined to the kennel. He wouldn't settle anywhere else, Grace had explained, and nobody had argued with her. Daniel connected the cracked phone to a laptop, working through layers of encryption with the focused patience of a man who'd clearly done this before, while Mateo paced behind him, jaw tight, saying nothing. "Most of it's gibberish without the right decryption key," Daniel said finally. "But I got into the message previews, enough to get a sense of what we're dealing with. Show me." Daniel turned the screen. Rows of messages filled the display, most in code, but a handful had come through in plain text. Careless moments, perhaps, or messages the sender had believed too urgent to bother encrypting. "Wedding date confirmed. Access window closes the moment she's officially family. Move faster. Captain's name still incomplete. Need the last 3 before ceremony. Volkov wants confirmation the codes work before the transfer." Mateo's face had gone entirely still. The particular stillness Grace had learned meant something dangerous was moving beneath the surface. "Volkov," he said quietly. "The rival family," Daniel confirmed. "Boss, this isn't blackmail. This isn't even a simple leak. She's been gathering access codes, financial records, names of every captain loyal to you. Everything the Volkovs would need to dismantle this entire operation in a single coordinated strike. The wedding." Grace's stomach turned. "The messages keep mentioning the wedding date. It's not a wedding." Mateo's voice had gone cold, flat, stripped of every trace of the warmth she'd glimpsed in the garden. "It's a deadline." He sat down heavily, staring at the screen, at 2 years of a relationship he'd believed was real, dissolving into something far uglier with every message Daniel scrolled through. "I need to be alone," he said finally. Daniel hesitated, then nodded, gathering the laptop and phone, before retreating from the room. Grace rose to follow, giving him the space she assumed he wanted, until his voice stopped her at the door. "Stay." She turned back. He hadn't moved from the chair, his eyes still fixed on some point in the middle distance, the composed, controlled mask he wore for the rest of the world, entirely absent now. 2 years, he said quietly. "I've spent 2 years believing I finally found someone who wanted me. Not the empire, not the money. Me." A humorless sound escaped him, not quite a laugh. "My own dogs understood the truth before I did." Grace crossed the room slowly, sitting in the chair across from him, rather than offering hollow comfort from a distance. "I'm not going to tell you it doesn't hurt," she said. "Pretending it doesn't would be its own kind of lie, and I think you've had enough of those lately." "Then what would you tell me?" "That the betrayal is real, and it's going to hurt for a while, and that's not weakness. It's just what happens when someone spends 2 years lying well." She held his gaze steadily. "But it doesn't mean you were foolish for trusting her. It means she was skilled at deception. Those are different things, even if they don't feel different right now." Something in his expression cracked, just slightly, the careful control he maintained for everyone else finally slipping in front of her. "Everyone around me lies," he said. "Business partners, rivals, half my own captains, if the price is right. I built my entire life assuming that was simply the cost of power. Isabella was supposed to be the one part of it that was real. I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry." His eyes found hers, something raw and unguarded in them. "You're the reason I know it all. You, and 2 dogs who apparently understood her better than I did in 2 years of engagement." Grace didn't have an easy answer for that, so she simply stayed, sitting with him in the quiet study while the last of the evening light faded from the windows, saying nothing further, offering only her presence in a moment that didn't call for words. It was, she realized later, the first time anyone had truly comforted Matteo Moretti without asking for anything in return. The wedding remained 3 days away. "We cancel it," Daniel said the following morning, laying out security assessments across the study desk. "Immediately. There's no reason to keep playing along now that we know the truth. If we cancel, she disappears." Matteo's voice was flat, calculated. The raw grief of the previous evening folded carefully back beneath the composed mask he wore for business. She warns the Volkovs, they regroup, and we spend the next year waiting for an attack we can no longer predict. So what's the alternative? We let the wedding proceed. Mateo's eyes were hard. We control the timeline instead of letting her control it. If the Volkovs believe their plan is succeeding right up until the moment we choose to end it, we have the advantage of surprise. Grace, standing quietly near the window, with a coffee tray she'd used as an excuse to remain in the room, felt a chill settle through her at the calculated coldness in his voice. "You're going to stand at an altar with her," she said, "knowing everything you know now. I'm going to end this the way it needs ending." Mateo's eyes met hers. "Quietly, on our terms, before more of my people end up like Salvatore." "That's not the same as being fine with it." "No," he admitted, something exhausted flickering behind his composure. "It's not." Daniel cleared his throat, redirecting the conversation with visible relief. "If we're doing this, we need blueprints. Full security overlay of the estate for wedding day. Every entrance, every exit, every place someone could position for an attack. I'll pull the estate's original architectural plans," Mateo said. "Full building schematics, going back to construction." It was Grace. 3 hours later, sorting through a box of old estate documents Mateo had asked her to help organize, who found something considerably more alarming than dusty blueprints. Tucked inside a folder marked with Isabella's neat handwriting, clearly misplaced among Mateo's own paperwork weeks earlier, forgotten in whatever careful system she'd used to hide her tracks, was a second set of plans. Not the estate's official layout. A tactical overlay, marked with precise notations, arrows, and timing sequences. Security rotation schedules, camera blind spots, and, circled in red near the estate's grand ballroom, a single annotation that made Grace's blood run cold. Ceremony begins, 4 p.m. Strike window, 4:15 to 4:30. Confirm all exits sealed before engagement. She carried the folder to Mateo's study without waiting to be asked, setting it on his desk with hands that had begun to shake. "I think I found their plan," she said quietly. "The whole thing, every detail." Mateo's face drained of color as he read through the pages, understanding dawning with each careful annotation. The assassins wouldn't strike outside the ceremony, waiting for some vulnerable moment during the reception. They were planning to attack during the vows themselves. 15 minutes into the ceremony, Mateo said, staring at the annotation as though he could make it mean something less catastrophic by sheer force of will. "In front of every family, every politician, every business contact I've spent 15 years cultivating. It's not just an assassination attempt." Grace's voice was steady, despite the tremor still working through her hands. "Read the notation again. Confirm all exits sealed before engagement. They're not planning to kill you and disappear, Mateo. They're planning to trap everyone inside." Daniel had gone very still, studying the tactical overlay with the focused intensity of a man recalculating an entire operation from the ground up. "This isn't a hit. This is a purge. They're planning to eliminate your entire leadership structure in a single afternoon. Then we change the plan." Mateo's jaw was set, the raw grief of the previous evening entirely submerged now beneath cold, methodical calculation. "We don't cancel the wedding. We rebuild the security around this exact document. If they believe they know our exits, our blind spots, our timing, we use that against them." "Boss, this is an enormous risk." "I'm aware of the risk, Daniel." Mateo's voice cut sharp. "I'm also aware that if we cancel now, they simply regroup and strike somewhere we don't see coming. At least here, we know the battlefield." The following 2 days blurred into a controlled, exhausting rhythm. Daniel repositioning security teams to counter every blind spot marked on Isabella's stolen blueprints. Mateo meeting privately with his most trusted captains to prepare contingencies Grace wasn't cleared to hear. Wedding preparations continuing in full, glittering view for anyone watching who mustn't suspect a thing had changed. Isabella herself seemed entirely unaware that her plans had been discovered, gliding through final fittings and floral arrangements with the same effortless composure she'd worn since the day Grace arrived, utterly convinced her deception remained perfectly intact. Grace found herself at Matteo's side more often now, not by any formal arrangement, but simply because the work required it, cross-referencing security schedules, memorizing which staff members could be trusted absolutely and which remained, worryingly, unaccounted for. "You should sleep," she told him, close to midnight on the second evening, finding him still hunched over blueprints in his study, Titan curled loyally at his feet, despite the dog's healing shoulder. "I sleep when this is finished. You'll make worse decisions exhausted than you would rested. Since when did you become my keeper?" Though there was no real edge to it, something almost fond, beneath the exhaustion in his voice. "Since your dogs decided I was worth listening to, apparently." Grace pulled a chair beside his desk, studying the security overlay herself. "Here, this corridor near the kitchen. Isabella's document marks it as an exit, but Daniel's notes say it's actually been sealed for renovation since spring." Matteo leaned closer to look, close enough that Grace caught the faint, familiar scent of him, cedar, and something warmer beneath it, an intimacy she hadn't fully registered building between them until this exact moment, his shoulder nearly brushing hers. "You're right," he said quietly, though his eyes had drifted from the blueprint to her face. "That's an entire flank they'll believe is open. We could position a team there without them ever suspecting. That's what I thought." Neither of them moved. "Grace." His voice had gone lower, rougher, something unguarded finally breaking through the careful composure he'd maintained through 2 exhausting days. "I need to tell you something, and I'm aware the timing is entirely wrong. Then maybe don't. I don't seem to have much control over it anymore." His hand found hers on the desk, tentative, testing whether she'd pull away. She didn't. "You walked into my life 2 weeks ago, carrying a mop and a lunch bag, and somehow you've become the only person in this entire house I trust completely. That terrifies me considerably more than the Volkovs do. Matteo, I know this is impossible timing. I know I'm supposed to be marrying someone else in less than 48 hours, someone who's been quietly planning to destroy everything I've built." His thumb traced gently across her knuckles. "But I find I can't stop thinking about you, and I'm tired of pretending otherwise." Grace's heart hammered, every professional instinct screaming caution, even as something considerably less sensible urged her closer. "This is a terrible idea," she whispered. "Almost certainly." Neither of them pulled away. He leaned in slowly, giving her every opportunity to stop him, and she found she had absolutely no intention of doing so, her breath catching as the distance between them shrank to almost nothing. Titan's head snapped up. The dog was on his feet in an instant, a low, urgent bark, tearing through the quiet study, already bolting toward the door with an intensity that had both Matteo and Grace jumping apart, adrenaline flooding through the interrupted moment. "Titan." Matteo was on his feet immediately, following the dog's frantic path down the hallway, Grace close behind. The dog led them straight toward Matteo's private bedroom, barking sharply at the closed door, hackles raised, every instinct in his body screaming warning. Matteo drew his weapon before opening the door, pushing it inward with careful, controlled speed. The room was empty, but the wall safe, hidden behind a false panel Grace hadn't even known existed until this exact moment, stood wide open. Its heavy steel door swung outward, contents visibly disturbed. "Someone's been in here." Matteo's voice had gone flat, dangerous. "Recently." Titan caught the scent before we ever reached the hallway. Daniel arrived moments later, weapon drawn, sweeping the room before holstering it, with visible frustration. No sign of forced entry. Whoever did this had a key, or knew the combination. "Isabella," Grace said quietly. Matteo crossed to the open safe, checking its contents with hands that had gone noticeably tense. Financial records, captain assignments for the wedding security detail, everything she'd need to finalize their attack plan. His jaw tightened. She's not just planning anymore. She's confirming. The wedding's in less than 2 days. Then we don't have room for further mistakes. Mateo closed the empty compartments of the safe with controlled, deliberate movements, though Grace could see the tension radiating through his shoulders. Not just professional urgency, but something rawer beneath it. The particular exhaustion of a man discovering, again and again, exactly how thoroughly he'd been deceived. He turned toward Grace, something apologetic in his expression despite everything. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "for the interruption. For all of it, honestly. You deserve considerably better timing than a mafia war and a stolen safe combination." "I'm not exactly complaining about the company," Grace said, managing a small, tired smile despite the tension still coiled through the room. "Even if your dogs have terrible timing. They've never been wrong before." Mateo glanced toward Titan, who'd finally settled, though his ears remained alert, watchful. "I don't imagine tonight's an exception." Daniel cleared his throat, holding up a small evidence bag containing a single, dark hair recovered from the safe's edge. Too long, too dark, to belong to anyone but one specific member of the household. "Boss," he said grimly, "I think we just found our confirmation." The morning of the wedding arrived gray and humid. The estate's grounds transformed overnight into something out of a magazine spread. White chairs arranged in careful rows across the south lawn, a canopy of flowers arching over the altar, string quartet already tuning quietly near the reception tent, while caterers moved in disciplined, silent efficiency through the kitchen. Grace stood at the edge of it all in her staff uniform, watching the transformation with a knot of dread she couldn't quite shake. Titan pressed close against her leg, despite Dolores's repeated, increasingly exasperated attempts to keep the dogs confined for the day. "He won't settle in the kennel," Grace had explained, for what felt like the 10th time. "Not today." Dolores had finally given up arguing. "You understand what today actually is," Daniel said quietly, appearing at Grace's shoulder as she watched security staff disguised as valets take up careful positions around the property's perimeter. "Not a wedding. A trap. If anything goes wrong." "I understand." Grace's eyes tracked a cluster of arriving guests, politicians and business leaders, and, scattered among them, representatives from families whose names she'd learned to recognize over the past 2 weeks with growing unease. "Where do you need me?" Kitchen staff, same as always, moving through the reception area. Daniel's jaw was tight. "But if things go wrong, the security control room is your fallback. It's the one place in this house built to withstand almost anything, and it gives you eyes on every camera on the property." "You think things are going to go wrong?" "I think we're staking Mateo's entire empire on the assumption that Isabella's people don't know we've discovered their plan." Daniel's expression didn't waver. "I'd rather you know where safety is, just in case that assumption is wrong." She found Mateo an hour before the ceremony, alone in his private quarters, dressed in the sharp black tuxedo he'd be married in, staring at his own reflection with an expression Grace hadn't seen from him before. Not fear, exactly, but something close to it, buried beneath layers of careful control. "You look like a man about to walk into a firefight," she said quietly, closing the door behind her. "That's essentially accurate. How are you, really? Not the security assessment, you." Mateo turned from the mirror, something raw flickering across his face before he caught himself, smoothing it back beneath the composed mask he'd need to wear for the next several hours. "I'm marrying a woman I now know intends to help destroy everything my family has built," he said. "I'm going to stand at that altar and say vows I know are lies, to a woman who's been lying to me for 2 years, in front of hundreds of people who have no idea what's actually about to happen." His jaw tightened. "I don't have a word for how I am. Terrified doesn't quite cover it." Grace crossed the room, taking his hands in hers, steady despite everything. "You're not doing this alone," she said. "Whatever happens today, you have Daniel, your captains, dozens of men who've prepared for exactly this. You have Titan and Nero, who've never once been wrong about anyone in this house. Her thumb traced gently across his knuckles. "And you have me." Something in his expression cracked. Gratitude and exhaustion, and something warmer tangled together. "I don't deserve that kind of loyalty," he said quietly. "Not from someone who's known me 2 weeks." "Loyalty isn't measured in weeks, Matteo. Titan figured that out about 30 seconds after meeting me." She managed a small, tired smile. "Maybe it's time you trusted your own instincts a little more too." He leaned forward, resting his forehead briefly against hers, both of them simply breathing together for a long, quiet moment, before a sharp knock at the door pulled them apart. "Boss." Daniel's voice, muffled through the wood. "It's time." Matteo straightened, the composed mask sliding back into place with practiced ease, though his eyes found Grace's one last time before he opened the door. "Stay close today," he said. "Please." "I will." The ceremony began precisely at 4 o'clock, exactly as the stolen blueprint had promised. Grace watched from near the reception tent, ostensibly arranging place cards, her eyes constantly tracking the crowd for anything out of place. A guard's uniform worn slightly wrong, a guest positioned too carefully near an exit, anything that might betray the attack they all knew was coming. Isabella walked down the aisle in ivory silk, radiant and composed, playing her role with the same flawless precision she'd maintained for 2 years, entirely unaware her deception had already been discovered. Matteo stood at the altar, jaw tight, watching her approach with an expression Grace suspected only she could read as anything other than a groom's nervous anticipation. The vows began. Grace's eyes swept the crowd again, methodical, careful, and stopped on a cluster of unfamiliar men near the eastern edge of the seating, their posture too rigid, their attention too focused on the perimeter rather than the ceremony itself. She recognized, with a cold lurch of dread, the careful stillness she'd seen once before, in a man waiting beside a dark sedan at the service gate. Volkov men, disguised as guests. She caught Daniel's eye across the crowd, offering the smallest, most deliberate nod toward the eastern seating, and watched his expression sharpen with immediate understanding. "To love and honor," the officiant continued, oblivious, "in sickness and in health, until death do you part." Isabella's eyes flicked briefly toward the eastern seating, something calculating and cold passing across her composed expression. A woman checking that her allies were exactly where they needed to be. Grace's stomach turned to ice. "Matteo," the officiant said, "do you take Isabella?" The first man near the eastern seating reached beneath his jacket. Grace didn't hesitate. "Gun!" she screamed, the word tearing across the quiet ceremony a half-second before chaos erupted entirely. Guests scattered, screaming, chairs overturning as the disguised Volkov men drew weapons in unison, gunfire cracking sharp across the manicured lawn. Matteo moved instantly, tackling Isabella to the ground. Not out of tenderness, Grace understood immediately, but out of pure tactical reflex, using her body as cover, while he drew his own weapon in the same fluid motion. Daniel's security team, already positioned according to the counterplan, returned fire with brutal, controlled precision, cutting down 2 attackers before they'd fully cleared their weapons. Titan and Nero, who'd been resting quietly near the altar throughout the ceremony, exploded into motion, snarling, driving themselves between fleeing guests and the nearest gunman with a ferocity that sent one attacker stumbling backward, his weapon clattering uselessly to the grass. "Grace!" Matteo's voice tore across the chaos, urgent, searching. "I'm here." She dropped low behind an overturned table, watching the ceremony collapse into a full battlefield around her. Guests fleeing in every direction, while gunfire continued to crack across the lawn. Isabella, momentarily freed from Matteo's protective grip amid the chaos, scrambled backward across the grass, her composed mask finally, completely shattering into something closer to panic. "You knew," she said, staring at Matteo with dawning, horrified realization. "You knew." "I know everything, Isabella." Mateo's voice was ice, his weapon still raised toward the retreating attackers. I know about the Volkovs. I know about the codes. I know exactly what this wedding was always meant to be. Isabella's face crumpled, something desperate and genuinely afraid replacing her earlier calculation, though Grace had no time to process what that expression might mean. Because across the chaos of the ruined ceremony, near the estate's old security wing, she'd just spotted movement in a window that was supposed to be empty, a figure watching the carnage below with careful, deliberate satisfaction, one hand resting on what looked, unmistakably, like a radio. Someone was directing the attack from inside the house. Grace didn't waste time deciding. Someone's in the old security wing, she shouted toward Daniel, already moving low across the chaos of the ruined ceremony, weaving between overturned chairs and fleeing guests toward the mansion's side entrance. They're directing this. I saw them in the window. Grace, wait. She didn't wait. Titan tore after her the moment he registered her direction, abandoning his position near the altar, Nero close behind, both dogs flanking her as she sprinted across the lawn toward the estate's older wing, gunfire still cracking behind them in ragged, decreasing bursts. The security wing had been decommissioned years ago, according to Dolores, replaced by newer systems in the estate's main house. The old control room left dusty and largely forgotten except by whoever had apparently decided it made the perfect hidden vantage point for directing an assassination. Grace reached the door breathless, Titan already snarling at the handle, and found it locked. She didn't have tools. She didn't have training for this. She had 2 furious pitbulls and a considerable amount of desperation. Move, she gasped, and Nero threw his considerable weight against the old wooden door, splintering it on the second attempt, the frame giving way in a shower of rotted wood. The control room beyond was dim, lit only by a bank of old monitors still somehow functioning, displaying grainy feeds of the estate's security cameras. A man stood at the center console, radio in hand, so absorbed in directing the chaos outside that he hadn't registered the door breaking behind him. He turned at the sound, and Grace recognized him instantly. The man from the service gate, the one she'd glimpsed beside Isabella's sedan days earlier. His professional stillness now replaced with genuine alarm as he found himself facing not security personnel, but a maid and 2 very large, very angry dogs. He reached for a weapon. Titan reached him first. The dog hit him with the full force of his charge, knocking the gun from his hand before he'd fully drawn it, both animals converging with a ferocity that sent the man crashing backward into the console, alarms and monitors flickering wildly under the impact. Titan, hold! Grace shouted, scrambling forward as the man struggled beneath the dog's weight, Nero blocking any attempt at escape with a low, continuous growl. Hold him! But she reached the console, scanning the bank of monitors with frantic urgency, and found what she needed almost immediately, a master control panel, clearly repurposed to override the estate's newer security system, feeding false camera loops to the main house while simultaneously coordinating the attacker's movements through an open radio channel. She had no idea what half the controls did, but she recognized a kill switch when she saw one. She slammed her palm against it. The monitors went dark. The radio channel cut to static. Somewhere across the estate, she hoped desperately, the attacker's coordinated advantage had just collapsed into confusion. It had. Outside, Mateo felt the shift immediately. The disguised gunman, who'd been moving with disciplined, coordinated precision moments earlier, suddenly faltering, glancing toward earpieces gone silent, their carefully planned assault disintegrating into disorganized panic. Now, Daniel's voice rang across the chaos, and Mateo's remaining captains pressed the advantage instantly, driving the confused attackers back toward the estate's perimeter with brutal, decisive force. Mateo fought through the chaos with cold, focused precision, years of buried discipline resurfacing with lethal efficiency, disarming one attacker and dropping a second before either had fully registered his approach. Around him, his men closed the trap methodically, cutting off retreat routes, until the remaining Volkov gunmen found themselves surrounded, weapons raised but hopelessly outmatched. It was over within minutes of the coordination collapsing. Matteo turned, breathing hard, scanning the wreckage of the ceremony for Grace, and felt his heart stop entirely when he couldn't immediately find her among the scattered, terrified guests. "The security wing," Daniel called, already moving toward the old building. She said someone was directing this from there. Matteo ran. He reached the shattered door of the old control room to find Grace kneeling beside the console, breathing hard but entirely unharmed. Titan still standing guard over a groaning, thoroughly subdued attacker, while Nero paced watchfully near the entrance. "Grace." Relief crashed through him so completely his knees nearly buckled. "You're all right." "I'm fine." She looked up, exhausted but steady. "I cut their coordination. Whatever advantage they had, it's gone now." Matteo crossed the room and pulled her up into his arms without a second's hesitation, holding her tightly enough that she felt the tremor still working through his hands. "You could have died," he murmured against her hair. "Running in here alone." "I wasn't alone." She glanced toward Titan, still standing his careful, watchful guard. "I had backup." Despite everything, despite the chaos still settling outside, Matteo managed something close to a broken laugh, pressing a kiss to her temple that felt, in that moment, entirely inevitable. They found Isabella 20 minutes later, cornered near the estate's south garden by two of Matteo's men. Her ivory wedding gown torn and grass-stained, all pretense of composure finally, completely abandoned. "It's over," Matteo said, his voice flat as he approached. Grace beside him, Titan pressed close against her leg. "Your people are dead or captured. Your handler in the security wing is in custody. There's nothing left to protect now, Isabella." She looked up at him, and for the first time since Grace had met her, something entirely unguarded broke through the woman's carefully maintained mask. Not calculation, not cold precision, but raw, desperate grief. "You don't understand," she said, voice cracking. "I never wanted this, any of it. You spent 2 years photographing my financial documents and feeding my captain's names to a rival family." Matteo said coldly. "Explain to me what part of that I'm supposed to misunderstand." "My brother." Isabella's voice broke entirely, tears finally spilling free. "Alessandro. The Volkovs took him 3 years ago. They told me they'd kill him if I didn't help them. Access, information, whatever they needed. Every single thing I did believing it would bring him home alive." Matteo's expression flickered, something conflicted breaking through his cold fury. "You expect me to believe that? I don't expect anything from you anymore." Isabella wiped at her tears, something broken and exhausted in her voice. "I loved you, Matteo. That part was never a lie, even if everything else was. But I would have destroyed your entire empire to save my brother, and I don't regret trying, no matter what it costs me now." Grace watched Matteo's face carefully, seeing the genuine conflict there, a man capable of coldness toward calculated betrayal, but visibly shaken by the possibility of desperate, misguided love beneath it. "Take her into custody," he said finally, his voice quieter now. "Carefully. I want her questioned, not harmed." Daniel nodded, gesturing for 2 guards to escort Isabella away, her sobs fading as she was led toward a waiting vehicle. Matteo stood in the wreckage of his own wedding, Grace beside him. The 2 dogs who'd started this entire chain of events pressed loyally against them both, and let out a long, exhausted breath. "It's over," he said quietly. It wasn't. Not entirely. Not until Daniel returned an hour later, his expression carefully composed, in a way that immediately told Grace and Matteo something else had gone wrong. "We ran the records on Isabella's brother," Daniel said, holding out a thin file. "Alessandro Romano. The Volkov's custody records, financial transfers, everything she believed was keeping him alive." Matteo took the file, reading through it with growing, horrified understanding. "He's been dead for months," Matteo said quietly, staring at a coroner's report dated well before the wedding plot had even fully taken shape. They kept using him as leverage after he was already gone. Grace felt something cold and sorrowful settle through her chest, understanding arriving all at once. Isabella hadn't just betrayed the man she loved. She'd sacrificed everything, destroyed everything, for a lie the Volkovs had been feeding her for months, after there was nothing left to save. The estate settled into an uneasy quiet over the following days, the wedding decorations dismantled, the ruined lawn slowly returning to order. Though nothing about the Moretti household felt entirely the same as it had before the ceremony collapsed into gunfire. The remaining Volkov operatives had been rounded up within 48 hours, Daniel's careful post-attack investigation unraveling the rest of the network with methodical precision. The threat, for now, had been dismantled completely. Isabella remained in custody, though Matteo had quietly arranged for her transfer to a private facility rather than handing her over to more traditional, considerably harsher forms of justice his world typically offered traitors. Grace hadn't asked why. She suspected she already understood. "I told her about Alessandro," Matteo said, finding Grace in the garden 2 days later, the same stretch of lawn where gunfire had torn through white folding chairs less than a week earlier. "About the coroner's report. How did she take it?" "Badly." His jaw tightened. She'd spent 3 years sacrificing everything for a brother who's been gone for months. The Volkovs kept using him as leverage long after there was nothing left to protect. He sat heavily on the garden bench, Titan immediately settling at his feet. "I keep trying to hate her completely. It would be considerably simpler. But you can't." "No." He looked up at Grace, something exhausted and conflicted in his expression. "She destroyed nearly everything I've built. She very nearly got you killed. And somewhere beneath all of that, she was also a woman desperately trying to save someone she loved, manipulated by people who never intended to give her brother back at all." His hands tightened briefly. "I don't know how to hold both of those truths at once." Grace sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched, Nero immediately pressing his head into her lap. "You don't have to resolve it neatly," she said. "Some things don't fit into simple categories. She did terrible things for a reason that was, in its own broken way, entirely human. Both of those things can be true without canceling each other out. You're remarkably forgiving, considering she nearly got you shot." "I'm not saying I forgive her." Grace's voice hardened slightly. "I'm saying I understand how someone ends up there. Those are different things." Matteo studied her for a long moment, something warm settling behind his tired eyes. "You have a talent for making impossible things feel manageable," he said quietly. "I've had practice. Rescue dogs everyone else had written off. Apparently it translates. Apparently." His hand found hers on the bench between them, fingers lacing together with a certainty neither of them questioned anymore. "I've spent 14 years believing trust was a liability, that letting anyone close simply gave them leverage to use against me eventually." His thumb traced gently across her knuckles. "You walked into my courtyard with a mop and a lunch bag, and every single one of my careful defenses started crumbling within the hour. Blame the dogs. They started it." "They did." Something soft crossed his face, entirely unguarded. "But I'm the one who couldn't stop thinking about you afterward. That part was entirely my own doing." He leaned in slowly, the same unhurried patience he'd shown days earlier before Titan's interruption. And this time, nothing stopped them, his mouth finding hers gently, carefully, like a man relearning something he'd genuinely forgotten he was capable of feeling. Grace kissed him back without hesitation, months of careful professional distance, dissolving entirely into something neither of them had planned for, and both of them, apparently, had wanted for considerably longer than either would admit. Titan let out a low, satisfied huff, resting his chin against Matteo's knee, as though personally approving the outcome he'd orchestrated from the very beginning. When they finally broke apart, Matteo rested his forehead against hers, both of them breathing unsteadily. "I meant what I said in the study," he murmured, before Titan interrupted us. You've become the one person in this entire house I trust completely. That's a considerable amount of trust to place in someone you've known 3 weeks. Apparently my dogs figured that out considerably faster than I did. His hand cupped her face gently. I'm simply catching up. Grace smiled, warmth spreading through her chest, despite everything the past week had cost them both, and let herself, finally, fully believe that whatever this was between them might actually be real. She found him again that evening, later, after the last of the day's security debriefings had finished, and something in her expression made him set down the paperwork he'd been reviewing immediately. Grace, what's wrong? Nothing's wrong, exactly. She twisted her hands together, the confidence she'd carried all week suddenly faltering. I've been thinking about my position here, about what happens now that the danger's passed. What are you saying? I think I should resign, she said quietly. I don't belong in this world, Matteo. Not really. I'm a temporary maid who got pulled into a mafia conspiracy by accident. Once the agency finds a permanent replacement, I think it's time I go back to my own life. Matteo's expression shifted, something stricken breaking through his usual composure. Grace, I need to think, she said softly, already turning toward the door. I'm sorry. I just need some time. She left before he could respond, Titan whining softly at the door she closed gently behind her, and Matteo sat alone in his study with the sudden, gutting realization that the one person who'd finally taught him how to trust again was preparing to walk out of his life entirely. Grace was gone by morning. Not fired, not dismissed. Simply gone. Her small room in the staff quarters stripped bare. A note left with Dolores explaining she'd taken the agency's next available placement and wouldn't be returning to the Moretti estate. Matteo read the note twice, standing in the empty room that had housed her for barely 3 weeks, feeling something hollow open up in his chest that no amount of controlled composure could quite manage. She left an address, Dolores offered carefully, watching him with the particular caution of someone who'd never seen Matteo Moretti look this unmoored. For her final paycheck, if you wanted it. Titan and Nero hadn't eaten breakfast. They sat by the front gate instead, ears alert, watching the driveway with the same patient, hopeful attention they'd shown every morning since Grace's arrival, as though certain, despite all evidence, that she would simply walk back through it. Matteo looked at them for a long moment. Get the car, he told Daniel. He found her 3 hours later in a modest apartment building on the city's east side, standing on the front steps with a suitcase in hand, apparently on her way to some new assignment the agency had already arranged. She froze when she saw him climbing out of the sleek black sedan, Titan and Nero bounding out immediately after him, tails wagging with an enthusiasm that drew startled looks from passing pedestrians. Matteo, what are you doing here? Refusing to let you disappear from my life without a fight, he said, crossing the distance between them while the dogs circled Grace joyfully, apparently thrilled to have located her again after a morning of anxious waiting. You left without saying goodbye. I said everything I needed to say last night. Grace's voice wavered slightly despite her attempt at composure. I don't belong in your world, Matteo. I'm a maid. You're the head of one of the most powerful families in Boston. Whatever happened between us these past 3 weeks, it was intense, and it was real, but it was born out of danger and adrenaline. That's not the same as something that survives ordinary life. You think what I feel for you only exists because of gunfire and betrayal? I think it's easy to mistake shared danger for something deeper. Then let me be clear about something. Matteo stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head to hold his gaze. I didn't fall for you during the gunfight in the garden, Grace. I fell for you the moment you told me my dogs had better instincts than my dating history. 3 days into knowing me, entirely unafraid of the consequences. His voice softened. I fell for you slowly, over quiet evenings polishing silver and arguing about blueprints and watching you treat 2 dogs everyone else feared like they were simply misunderstood. None of that required danger. It just required you being exactly who you are. Grace's eyes had filled with tears she was visibly fighting to hold back. I don't have money, Matteo. I don't have connections. or the kind of polish your world expects. I'm a maid who grew up training rescue dogs nobody else wanted. I don't want polish. I've spent my entire adult life surrounded by people who perfected exactly that, and every single one of them was eventually revealed to be lying about something. He reached for her hand, gentle, giving her every chance to pull away. I want honesty. I want someone who tells me the truth even when it's inconvenient, who treats gardeners and billionaires with exactly the same respect, who my own dogs trusted within 30 seconds of meeting her because apparently they understood something about you I needed considerably longer to recognize. Mateo, I'm not offering you wealth, Grace. I'm offering you honesty. A home. A man who spent 14 years believing love made him weak, until you proved him wrong without even trying. He knelt slowly, and Grace's breath caught entirely as she understood what was happening. My dog saw something in you long before I did. I'm simply asking you to give me the chance to finally catch up. He pulled a small box from his jacket, and before he could even open it fully, Titan wedged himself directly between them, tail wagging with such enthusiastic force that he knocked both Mateo and Grace clean off balance, sending them tumbling backward into the grass beside the sidewalk, in a tangle of laughter and startled surprise, Nero immediately piling on top of them both with equally chaotic joy. Grace's laughter rang out, unguarded and genuine, the first true, wholehearted sound of happiness Mateo could remember hearing from her since the wedding chaos began. I take it back, she gasped, still laughing, tangled beneath 80 pounds of overjoyed pitbull. They have terrible timing, but perfect instincts. They tend to have both simultaneously. Mateo, laughing despite himself, finally managed to extract the ring from where it had rolled into the grass, holding it up between them while both dogs continued their enthusiastic celebration. Grace Donovan, will you marry me? Properly, this time, without a rival family attempting a coordinated assassination during the vows? That's a considerably lower bar than most proposals, but I'll take it. She kissed him, laughing, surrounded by wagging tails and warm afternoon sun. Yes, obviously yes. They married 3 months later, in the same garden where gunfire had once torn through white folding chairs, the estate finally, fully at peace. Titan and Nero sat calmly beside the altar throughout the entire ceremony. The same dogs who'd once terrified every woman who came near their master, now serving as quiet, faithful witnesses to the love story they'd started the moment they chose, without hesitation, to trust a maid with a mop and a lunch bag over every carefully polished stranger who'd come before her. The dogs everyone feared turned out to be the only ones who could see the truth. If this story reminded you that the ones who love us most honestly are sometimes the ones with 4 legs instead of 2, hit subscribe, because this channel is full of stories exactly like this one. And tell me in the comments, have you ever had an animal see straight through someone before you did? Also, drop where you're watching from tonight. I love seeing how far Titan and Nero traveled. Type, "Dogs Don't Lie" below if this story just earned a permanent spot in your favorites. Thank you for watching until the very end.